As violence escalates in Portland, President Trump declares if, quote, mayor doesn't clean it up, we will go in and do it for them. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit the subscribe button. Today we're going to be talking about the ongoing violence in Portland, Oregon. For more than 3 months now, the federal courthouse in Portland has been under siege by Antifa and other radical left-wing protesters and rioters, and it can only be called open rebellion, and I think enough is enough, and it's time for the Oregon governor to call in the National Guard, but she was refusing to do so, and I think the reason is political. They need to, the Democrats, appeal to this radical left-wing movement of defund the police, and they feel like if they crack down on the rioters, that those protesters and rioters are going to turn against them, and I think they're right, and that's why this is ongoing, and we're kind of at a stalemate right now, which is why the federal government probably needs to act on Oregon's behalf before things get any worse, as the riots are turning deadly. Let's take a look at this. President Trump tweeted on August 31st, Portland is a mess, and it has been for many years. If this joke of a mayor doesn't clean it up, we will go in and do it for them. And so President Trump is getting tough, and it's about time. I think that he's issued this warning before, but now it's getting to the point where everyone knows that Oregon Governor Kate Brown and Portland Democratic Mayor Ted Wheeler are just not going to do anything. They've given into political violence in Portland, Oregon, and if they don't get it under control soon, then President Trump is warning he will have no other choice but to federalize the National Guard and to restore civil order. The siege of the Mark O. Hatfield Federal Courthouse by Antifa and other violent rioters, that's been going on for more than 3 months now. U.S. Marshals and other federal law enforcement have had to intervene to prevent that building from being burnt to the ground and more people from getting hurt. But on August 30th, the violence turned deadly. Here's a headline from Fox News. Portland fatal shooting. Victim's friend, quote, they executed my partner. They hunted him down. And I'm going to warn you, the following footage is very graphic, but you need to see it.
Mace in my eyes. Ow. Eyes.
So there you go. The police responded instantly. And this is the scene in Portland, Oregon, where people are just getting shot dead on the streets for their political affiliations and which group they happen to be with. Now, Aaron Danielson has been shot dead, very sadly, and the killer remains at large. He was a member of this Patriot prayer group that often clashes with Antifa in the streets of Portland. And now the president's call for Oregon to bring in the National Guard follows Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers calling in the National Guard and agreeing to federal assistance to rein in the riots there after the Kenosha shootings of Jacob Blake by police officer Rustin Shesky on August 23rd and Anthony Huber and Joseph Rosenbaum by Kyle Rittenhouse on August 25th. So this rapid escalation that you're seeing right now and are witnessing, I think it should be chilling for all Americans. It's a demonstration of what happens when riots are allowed to basically proceed unabated without law enforcement or the National Guard being called in. This is very dangerous. Now, armed citizens are going on the streets and taking matters into their own hands with deadly results. And is anyone really surprised? Portland is a powder keg, and it's been a hotbed for violence for years. It's open rebellion in the streets of America, and I think it's going to only get worse until authorities intervene and get this violence out of our cities. Now, last month in testimony before the House Judiciary Committee on July 28th, Attorney General William Barr was blasting the violence, and I think he has the right message. And unfortunately, this was a month ago, and still nothing's been done in Portland to rein in the violence and to end the riots. Let's listen to what he had to say. He describes the violence in very good detail, and so it gives you an idea of what's going on there and what it's like every single night in Portland.
Unfortunately, some have chosen to respond to George Floyd's death in a far less productive way by demonizing the police, promoting slogans like "all cops are bastard," and making grossly irresponsible proposals to defund the police. The demonization of the police is not only unfair and inconsistent with principles of all people should be treated as individuals, but gravely injurious to the inner city communities. When communities turn on and pillory the police, officers naturally become more risk averse and crime rates soar. Unfortunately, we are seeing that now in many of our cities. The threat to Black lives posed by crime on the streets is massively greater than any threat posed by police misconduct. The leading cause of death for young Black males is homicide. Every year, approximately 7,500 Black Americans are victims of homicide. The vast majority of them, around 90%, are killed by other Blacks, mainly by gunfire. Each of those lives matter. It is for this reason that in selected cities where there has been an upsurge in violent crime, we are stepping up and bolstering the activities of our joint anti-crime task forces. Finally, I want to address a different breakdown in the rule of law that we've witnessed over the past 2 months. In the wake of George Floyd's death, violent rioters and anarchists have hijacked legitimate protests to wreak senseless havoc and destruction on innocent victims. The current situation in Portland is a telling example. Every night for the past 2 months, a mob of hundreds of rioters have laid siege to the federal courthouse and other nearby federal property. The rioters have come equipped for fight, armed with powerful slingshots, tasers, sledgehammers, saws, knives, rifles, and explosive devices. Inside the courthouse are a relatively small number of federal law enforcement personnel charged with a defensive mission to protect the courthouse. What unfolds nightly around the courthouse cannot reasonably be called protest. It is, by any objective measure, an assault on the government of the United States.
There you go. It's an assault on the government of the United States. It's open rebellion, and the American people shouldn't have to put up with it. Now, why have Oregon authorities failed to act? That's anyone's guess. I think it's political, but the American people are blaming liberal city mayors. Voters say some big city leaders, most reporters, encourage violent protests. Voters think big city leaders in places like Portland and Seattle, where violent protests have gone on for weeks, are bringing the violence on themselves, with most reporters cheering on the protesters. The latest Rasmussen Reports national telephone and online survey finds that 50% of likely U.S. voters believe political leaders in some major cities like Portland and Seattle are encouraging violent protests by limiting the police response. Only 31% disagree. 19% say they're not sure. But of those who do agree, of the 50% in the sample, 72% are Republicans, 33% are Democrats, and 48% are unaffiliated with either party. And so basically 50%, half of the country, thinks that the liberal city mayors want this violence to be occurring. The only thing the riots and the lack of a meaningful response in some cases, unfortunately, is accomplishing is uniting public opinion against the rioters and these liberal city mayors. And when there is a clear dereliction of duty like this in order to maintain order by a state, then it's the federal government's job to step in and has a responsibility to act under the law. Under 10 U.S.C. Section 252, use of the militia and armed forces to enforce federal authority. This was enacted in 1792, was updated in 1795 by the Third Congress of the United States, again in 1807 and 1861, and then again in 1956. This law has been updated again and again. An act to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the United States, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, and to repeal the act now in force for those purposes. And this was utilized by President Abraham Lincoln in 1861 to wage the Civil War. Quote, "Now therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, in the virtue of the power in me invested by the Constitution and the laws, have thought fit to call forth, and hereby do call forth, the militia of the several states of the Union, in order to suppress said combinations and to cause the laws to be duly executed." This was also used by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1957 when Arkansas attempted to use the National Guard to block implementation of Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision to integrate schools. And Eisenhower said no, and he federalized the National Guard under this section of the law in order to ensure that Brown v. Board of Education would be enforced. And whereas certain persons in the state of Arkansas, individually and in unlawful assemblages, combinations, and conspiracies have willfully obstructed the enforcement of orders, whereas such willful obstruction of justice hinders the execution of the laws of that state and of the United States, makes it impractical to enforce such laws, whereas such obstruction constitutes a denial of the equal protection of the laws secured by the Constitution. I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, President of the United States, under and by virtue of my authority vested in me in the Constitution and the statutes of the United States, including Chapter 15, Title 10, U.S.C., particularly Sections 332, 333, and 334, do command all persons engaged in such obstruction to cease and desist therefrom and to disperse forthwith. And that's exactly what this section of law, which is still in effect, states. Whenever the president considers unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States, make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the U.S., any state, by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, he may call into federal service such of the militia of any state and use such of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or to suppress the rebellion. And I think that's exactly what we have here, is a violent rebellion in the streets of Portland. And it's going to probably have to be utilized yet again, just like Eisenhower and Lincoln did, in order to bring an end to this violence. And so we're not going to have more political violence and deadly shootings in the streets of Portland or elsewhere. In Wisconsin, you've had to deploy the National Guard there as well. Seattle had to deploy its police force to disperse the Chaz. And I think the longer this rebellion goes on in Portland and elsewhere and it's not put down, it's going to keep on spreading and it's going to keep on getting worse. That's why President Trump, I believe, has a duty to act. And I'll leave you with the close here. Are we witnessing the dawn of another civil war? It's an unsettling thought, but the longer it takes for the violence to be quelled, the more it looks that way, and the danger grows that it will continue to spread everywhere. The president has a responsibility, first and foremost, to preserve the Union. Oregon had its chance. Time's up. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.